Imagine a cold Detroit evening in the early 70s. A battered 1969 Chevelle SS rolls to a stoplight, its faded paint interrupted by primer patches and uneven body lines. Beside it idles a flawless Plymouth Cuda, wearing a 446 pack and boasting nearly 400 horsepower of Mopar pride. The Cuda's driver glances over and smirks. On paper, this shouldn't even be a race. The light turns green. The Chevelle leaves like it's been launched from a slingshot. By the time the Cuda driver reacts, all he sees are taillights shrinking into the night. No tricks, no hidden nitrous, just a stock 396 big block rated at 325 horsepower, badly outgunned in theory, yet completely dominant in reality. That moment wasn't luck. It was the result of understanding something most of Detroit had forgotten. For nearly 3 years, that rough-looking Chevelle ruled the streets of Michigan, humiliating cars with 50, 75, even 100 more horsepower. Cars that cost far more. Cars that should have won every time. And the man behind it wasn't a factory-backed racer or a professional engineer. He was a tool and die maker named Frank Moretti, working second shift at a transmission plant and experimenting late into the night inside a modest 2-car garage in Dearborn. What Frank uncovered would eventually force Hot Rod magazine to rethink how it tested cars and quietly unsettle Chevrolet's own engineers. His obsession wasn't horsepower, it was airflow behavior, torque delivery, and mechanical efficiency. And his Chevelle became proof that in drag racing, raw horsepower numbers mean very little if you don't know how to use them. To understand why his car was so devastating, you have to rewind to 1969, the absolute peak of the muscle car era. Detroit was intoxicated by displacement. Bigger engines meant bigger headlines. 427s, 440s, 454s. Compression ratios climbed until pump gas barely tolerated them. If it was massive, it sold. That single model year delivered legends: the Copo Camaro, the Boss 429 Mustang, the Roadrunner with the 4-barrel package, the Charger Daytona. Chevrolet's answer in the mid-size muscle segment was the Chevelle SS. Most buyers chose one of 396 big block options, with horsepower ratings ranging from 325 to 375. On paper, they were strong. In practice, most were leaving enormous performance untapped. Frank bought his Marina Blue Chevelle new from a dealership on Michigan Avenue. It came with the 350 horsepower L34 engine, a close ratio 4-speed, and conservative factory gearing. For half a year, he drove it exactly as it left the showroom, learning its behavior, feeling where it pulled and where it fell flat. Then he stopped driving and started measuring. Instead of bolting on shiny parts, Frank treated the car like a math problem. He borrowed flow benches and precision tools from work. He logged time on an early computer terminal tied to a GM mainframe. For months, he changed nothing. He only observed air velocity, pressure loss, intake geometry, exhaust behavior. Notebook after notebook filled with data. What he discovered stunned him. The factory intake manifold was designed for airflow peaks at engine speeds the camshaft would never allow. The engine was breathing through passages optimized for 6,500 RPM, while the valve train signed off a full 1,000 RPM earlier. Worse, the carburetor to plenum transition created turbulence exactly where street engines lived, between idle and mid-range. But the real breakthrough came when Frank stopped thinking about horsepower and started thinking about time. Street races weren't won at the finish line, they were won in the first few seconds. It wasn't about top speed, it was about how much force reached the pavement from 0 to 80 miles per hour. Beyond that, the race was already decided. The equation was simple. Wheel torque equals engine torque multiplied by gear ratios minus losses. Everyone obsessed over engine output. Frank focused on multiplication. A big Chrysler 440 made enormous torque, but with tall rear gears and wide ratio transmissions, it spent much of a run outside its sweet spot. Frank's 396 made less peak torque, but his gearing allowed it to stay almost perfectly inside its optimal range through every shift. The result wasn't more torque at the crank, it was more torque at the tires, averaged across the entire run. His so-called weird trick wasn't one modification, it was 3 precise changes working together. First, he made his cylinder head ports smaller, not bigger. He welded material into them and reshaped the airflow path to increase velocity at low and mid-lift. Peak airflow dropped, but usable airflow increased dramatically where the engine actually operated. Second, he reworked the intake manifold using principles borrowed from aircraft engines. Inside the plenum, he fabricated internal velocity stacks for each runner. They looked strange, almost wrong, but they eliminated turbulence and dramatically increased airflow speed. High RPM power suffered. Mid-range response exploded. Third, he altered the transmission itself. Custom-cut gears with slightly revised ratios paired with a steeper rear end. Individually, the changes looked insignificant. Together, they kept the engine locked in its torque band from launch to 80 miles per hour. When Frank finally brought the Chevelle to the drag strip, no one paid attention. It looked unfinished. Then it ran a 12-second pass at over 100 miles per hour. Stock cars like it barely broke 14. Even stranger, faster cars trapped at higher speeds but ran slower elapsed times. Frank's Chevelle accelerated harder early and never gave the advantage back. Street racers took notice. A Plymouth GTX owner accused him of cheating. Frank popped the hood. No bottles, no secrets. Just that odd intake and carefully chosen gears. Then Hot Rod magazine called. They were skeptical, but curious. In late 1971, they tested Frank's car against factory benchmarks. The results confused everyone. His Chevelle made far less wheel horsepower than a 454 LS6, yet ran nearly the same times. The difference was the torque curve. Frank's engine delivered strong, consistent torque across a wide RPM range. The LS6 made massive numbers briefly, then fell off. Acceleration favored consistency, not peaks. Hot Rod published the story and the industry noticed. Engineers visited. Companies offered money. Frank refused. He wasn't chasing fame. The irony was that Detroit needed exactly what Frank had built. Emissions rules were tightening. Fuel economy mattered. Efficiency was suddenly critical. GM engineers studied his car and found improvements in fuel consumption, pumping losses, and drivability that aligned perfectly with future challenges. Frank had solved problems the industry hadn't even fully recognized yet. By the mid-70s, muscle cars faded away. Insurance, fuel prices, and regulations ended the era. Frank kept refining quietly, eventually achieving even quicker times with subtle aerodynamic tricks hidden beneath a stock hood. His final recorded race came against a heavily modified Cuda, claiming 500 horsepower. Frank's Chevelle still ran the same bottom end it had years earlier, lower trap speed, faster elapsed time. Again, soon after, Frank moved on, taking an engineering role in Detroit. The Chevelle was stored, preserved exactly as it had been. Decades later, it found its way into the GM Heritage Center, still wearing its primer scars and unconventional intake. Modern engines now use refined versions of Frank's ideas: tuned intakes, variable valve timing, multi-speed transmissions, all chasing the same goal he solved with hand calculations and patience. Frank Moretti passed away in 2019, but his legacy lives on. Not in marketing slogans or spec sheets, but in garages where people think before they spend, where performance is treated as a system, not a shopping list. His story reminds us that speed isn't about excess, it's about understanding. And sometimes the guy in the garage really does know something the engineers missed. So the next time a car runs faster than it should, look closer. There might be another Frank behind it.